Okay. Hey everyone, welcome to another Working Group LTS meeting. And I'm Dhaval Bhanashali. I'm your host today. Let me start with reminding you that today's meeting is getting recorded. The CNCF code of conduct is in place. So be awesome to everyone. And since it's recorded, don't say anything that you don't want to say and get it recorded on the internet. Hey everyone. So let's get started with today's agenda. Before we start, who wants to be the note taker today? Any volunteers?
I can do it.
Hey Tim, thanks. Yep. So I'm gonna share the doc for the notes in the chat. Please add yourself as an attendee there and any identification that can be used to reach out to you after the meeting if someone wants to reach out to you. Yep, done. Let's start with today's agenda. The first step is project board and issues. Who wants to
I
take it
put
up?
that on the agenda. You had mentioned to me that I had volunteered to make a little bit of a project management thing, and I had completely forgotten about that, and I'm not sure that it ended up in that day's notes. So I think Stephen Augustus made this for us, but need to actually put cards and content in it. So I will do that. But other than that, I just wanted to mention that the board exists. It's blank right now.
Yep, the board exists, and we need to form a working group LTS team so that we can get rights to add elements to the board. So we need to probably chalk out a plan around that. Who wants to be on the team? Who should be able to add issues to it? How do we add it? There is a label working group LTS now, I believe. So
it looks like it is actually open. So Lubomir just did a test card. Yeah.
I was going to mention that you should limit access to admins only.
Yes, I think that's true, and I'm not sure why it is not turned off by default. So
I'll check with Stephen and see what permissions he had set up on it and what he intends, and if we can. I don't know if we need to be particularly tight on it, or if we just make it open to the like if GitHub allows us to grant access to the work group Google group membership, or what?
Group memberships are limited to GitHub teams,
okay, that makes
or
sense.
to the org in general. So I just saw an email. We actually have bot management of GitHub teams now, which is pretty great. So if we had a work group LTS team, people can ask to be added to that team via pull requests, and so that's a pretty reasonable way to manage membership. And then org visible or public visible makes sense.
You should do it because there is no undo like Google Docs. So if Kubernetes member edits this project, you cannot undo the changes.
I see Aaron just sent an email out like in the last half hour. Aaron Kragenberger.
oh, okay. I'm trying to search for the pull request where the board was created, and I can't find it. So if anybody can find it, that should be awesome. I can share it on the notes, and
I can, since it was set up by Stephen, I can just ping him directly and see what he'd set up to, and so I'll take the action to chase that down and see what we can do to connect to that PR flow for a team.
So do you have to add issues to the board, or if you tag issues with certain label, they automatically get attached to the board? Is there a way?
They don't get added automatically yet. You can search within the board for things with that label. and then easily drag them into the board.
Interesting.
So there has to be a workgroup LTS label or something like that.
Yeah, I think there was some discussion around having working group labels also, and in the pull request for creating the board, Stephen did mention something about working about a label, and he did try doing /working group LTS. I don't know what's the what's the status, so I can follow up, or Tim, when you speak to Stephen, you can just let us know what's on the label. Yep, he nodded. So yay. Anything on the issues? Do we want to discuss any specific issues? Nope. Yes. So one thing that came up in the Kubernetes release meetings was the discussion on dependency of other projects, and one of the dependencies was Go. One of the reasons that Aaron Krickenberger mentioned that we are updating to 1.12 is the support cadence, and it's much better over the long term to have Go 1.12 and move to newer versions of Go sooner, and at least for 1.14, since we have another week. So during that conversation, a lot of conversation around docs and release notes around supportability of other products around Kubernetes and what is the Kubernetes project itself. The questions came out, but however, since the release burn down meeting isn't the right place, the discussion didn't go further. But I think it's kind of important to notice that a lot of other SIGs are noticing we need to kind of define where the definition of Kubernetes as a project, what are the boundaries, and how do the boundaries interact with the support with respect to the support cadence. So it was a good discussion. I don't think it made any progress, but maybe something in the SIG release to bring up next time and see how the working group can look at it. Anybody else has any other comments on that? Any other SIGs discuss something similar? The last week's discussion on Docker brought up by Justin was, I think on the email we see that SIG node today might have someone from Docker to carry forward the discussion on how can we homogenize the releases of Kubernetes, and for older versions of Kubernetes, what would we do with unsupported versions of Docker? So I did see a mail thread on that, followed up by SIG-node chair. I forgot the name. So yeah, probably after this meeting, there's a SIG-node meeting. So if anybody is interested, we should probably plug in there. I'll probably next week give you guys status on what happened in that meeting. Should be interesting to see where it goes. Yep, that's it on this topic. Anybody has anything else to comment on that? Nope. So I'll take up the next item, the survey status. The Survey Monkey link is available, so I encourage everyone to just go and fill the surveys yourselves and also forward it to anyone you think is the right candidate for this survey. I've reached out to Kubernetes Dev for this, and I'm planning to go to all stakeholders meetings and do this. I wasn't well last week, so I was a little slow in going to some of these meetings or adding to their agendas. We reached out to CNCF. Ihor is helping us in reaching out to the CNCF end user community. We have a mail thread which Ihor initiated about the survey. So let's see where it goes. I'll give you guys updates next, give you folks updates next meeting on that, and that's an action item I'll take up. One question that what's up?
Have you got any numbers yet on how many people have done it already?
We don't have access to that because the admins are Ihor and probably a couple of more people. So Stephen is one of them, and he was kind enough to help us. Yeah, a shout out to Stephen for sitting about 4 or 5 hours with me multiple days across multiple days after working hours. So yeah, we were able to get the survey out and make the best out of the Survey Monkey tool. We did find the user experience of SurveyMonkey not being that great. So if you have lots of questions and moving the questions around is quite a challenge, and you need to really know the tool to work with it. So yeah, it's one experience. I mean, ultimately the user experience of filling a survey is great with SurveyMonkey, but creating a survey is not. Branching was challenging also. So the questions have a yes or no questions before you fill a section, so that you don't fill answers that do not matter to you. If you think there is any change, or there's a typo or anything that needs to change in the survey, please reach out to me. I'll try to, or reach out to us on anyone on the working group LTS channel, and then we'll probably Stephen or someone else who has admin access can make modifications. I don't know if you can make modifications now, but I did see a behavior which I thought we could modify or tweak a little. So I've reached out to Stephen. I'm yet to hear back on that.
We made any commitments about when we'll be analyzing the data?
Good question, and that was the next thing I wanted to bring up is how long do we want the survey to be open? Anybody has any comments? Lubomir, you folks had a survey before open, so.
So we did take some actions after we analyzed the survey, and because we want to comply with the users, and the biggest request was HA support in KubeADM needed some attention, and we pretty much made it a P0 for this cycle to improve HA, and that's what we are doing. So
how long was your survey open?
The survey was open for a couple of months.
Okay.
That feels about right for a timeline to me too, for us.
Anybody else had experience with any CNCF related surveys?
The timing of that is good. Like if we decide like kind of endish of April to close it, then we can do some analysis and thinking, and that can feed what we present as a working group at KubeCon EU.
I agree with that. Let's keep it at 2 months then.
Yep.
This was similar time frame for what the SIG PMs last year's survey was also on for around a similar period. So it should be probably a good time frame, and will give us good time to go and reach out to other people reach as many people as we want. And I'll try to find out from Stephen how many have already responded based on our communications, regular channels, and what else can we do to reach out to more. Maybe I'll talk to Paris to see what they did for the Contribex surveys and how did they reach out, because I do see some email threads where initially they had challenges having number of participants on the survey. So we will learn from others' techniques.
I've got some pretty good like individual responses just to the idea of the survey when I've been talking to people about it at meetups and user groups and things like that. Yeah, so people have been very interested. Especially, I try to phrase it as, oh, if you found upgrading a bit tricky and you want to rant at somebody, guess what? There's a great place for you to do that. People usually are more interested.
So to pick a concrete day, KubeCon EU is the week of May 20th. Do you think ending it on Friday, May 3rd or Friday, April 26th? Either of those would be open roughly a month and give a couple of weeks ahead of KubeCon.
2 months, right?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to open the calendar to see what.
We have work group meetings scheduled for Tuesday, April 30th and Tuesday, May 14th. So if we closed it on April 26th, that would give us 2 meetings to discuss and think ahead of KubeCon.
Yeah, 26 sounds like a good date for ending it, and 30th is our next meeting after that, so we could discuss. 14th is close to KubeCon, and probably everybody would be busy in pre-KubeCon activities too. Yeah, I think it makes sense to close it around 26th of April.
I agree.
Okay, then the date is April 26th and until we find some other issues with it. So yeah, that's it from the agenda. Anybody else has anything else to bring up?
I was sorry, you go, Jordan.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, has anyone had any chance to think about Tim St. Clair's KEP proposal? I had a bit of a look at it and have been, just thinking about it and I've actually talked to a few people about it as well. The general consensus from like end user people I've talked to has been reasonably positive. I think that at this point, people will take anything we give them to help improve the upgrade story a bit.
I still have the action. I'd volunteered to, I've got like a more detailed sketch of the drawing he had done, and I want to make that into like a online shareable format so it's easier to communicate visually what he was describing. I've been thinking about it back, like kicking it back and forth in my head, and I have some concerns, but I also think like there's multiple different ways that you can change cadences to do this type of thing, and that's definitely an established pattern what he was describing there. But yeah, the devil's in the details always.
Yeah, I completely agree.
There are two perspectives to it. One is what are the details? There's less meat in the proposal right now, so I think when the doc gets much more mature, we'll get much more feedback from the community. Things like how many days with the stable release overlap with another stable release. What is the benefit of that overlap? What is the operationalization? I mean, how will the Kubernetes project implement this? What needs to be done from the Kubernetes project's perspective? Also, the survey data will kind of tell us what areas the users are facing issues, and how will this proposal solve those problems. So these are some of the things I think would be good to target at. But I think the first step is to get more details into the proposal, get the doc filling, and I've not taken up an action item on the doc itself, so that's one other action item for me.
Can someone share a link
on that proposal? I was having a little bit of difficulty following what it would change as far as development in what he called the dev stream, as far as mechanics about how experimental things or alpha level things were done and then not included in the stable branch or disabled, but in a way that allowed flexibility to change them in the alpha dev branch. I had a pretty hard time following that to understand if it was feasible.
Yeah, I agree, and that is exactly the sort of thing that I've been sort of not sure about. I mean, I'm kind of more I'm kind of more the end user representative in this group, and so I don't have a lot of familiarity with the general how the general project stuff works. And so I completely agree that feels like the thing that will be the hardest to figure out. The other stuff feels easier to me.
That was one of my big questions. Was I can kind of imagine it in Kubernetes perspective. You have feature gates, and like you'd have some policy declared, like enabled here versus disabled there. But I wasn't sure. He hadn't quite described what the mechanism, or if there was one in the past, whether like code was just in both places and there was sort of a non-support statement in that branch and a support statement in that branch, but that the details of how they operationalize that, whether it was kind of documentation level versus actually mechanical or not, or actually like code is in that branch versus not in that branch, it wasn't fully clear.
Yeah. So I guess the thing I wanted to get by raising it was just to have us remind each other that it's there, and that that it is good to think about it at least.
One of the things I don't think I forget if we'd gotten into in the discussion 2 weeks ago, but at some point I'd asked Tim maybe one-on-one this, but like, would this be done, would it be sort of in conjunction with a proposal to do feature branches, for example, and have code being developed somewhere versus in the dev branch, and then how things flow? And he seemed to not be a fan of feature branches.
Yeah, it would be good to just hash out on what the goal of having more feature branches in the project and how it helps the project. If you could start with there, Tim, that would give us more chance to comment on that. Tim. I was asking, you were the Tim I was referring, Tim Pepper. Could you give us more idea on what's the goal of feature branches? Where is it being tracked? Which SIG is, or what is tracking it?
I don't think anybody is exactly tracking or pushing on that. There's 2, I think, feature branches open right now as sort of an experiment to see, but in other projects in open source, it's been a way of managing some of this flux to give a place where things can be trialed and matured ahead of merging into something for a more formal release-oriented branch or support-oriented branch. But that staging of early stuff to ready-to-use stuff to capable of being supported stuff, that flow is it's not super formal, I feel like, in this project. And I don't know if that's something then that you would want to change the formalities of, or the mechanisms around. So like, I don't know if the question was like, what is a feature branch, but the idea, like, you have branches. We arbitrarily mostly develop on master branch. People make PRs against master branch. You don't have to work that way. You could have the branch that is the one where a bunch of different work is aggregated for some kept feature or something larger like that. And when the stakeholders are happy with it, they PR the content of that branch over to master or whatever the support stream branch is.
Yeah, I think it would be much more easier if there's a documentation kept kind of to explain what are the bounds of feature branch, when what you create a feature branch, what is you wouldn't. There is a chance of feature branches living there forever, not getting rebased. There are issues with the approaches of feature branch. It would be interesting to see this, at the scale of Kubernetes project, how does this help? And this questions can be asked if there is a KEP, there is a working group, or there is a SIG there where this is discussed. That's why I was bringing it up, saying, okay, when we compare this, both needs to, we need to look at both the sides.
I mean, to go back to Tim's proposal, I guess that it seems like the things that we need are, to make it more specific, I think things that we need are, a bit more clarity around, like, if you're going to have a devel train and a stable train, what does as Jordan said, what does the devel train look like compared to what the master one looks like now? How do you do the, like, how would you mechanically turn off the code from between the devel and the stable branch? Is it just feature flags? Is it documentation, as Tim says? I think those are the sort of the two key things that we need to establish to then be able to put more detail around how something like that might even work. And I think we need to have the detail around before how it might even work before we can talk very cogently about if it's a good idea or not.
And how there's a possibility that both ideas could have an intersection somewhere. They would solve each other's problems. So it would be good to see. And yep, we should probably get this. It would be good to hear what Tim Sinclair's comments on this would be.
Yeah, the two things I want to make sure we avoid are decoupling the dev branch process-wise from the stabilizing influences of release, but doing it in a way that unstable nature actually bleeds through into the release branch. Like if we say, oh yeah, well, dev branch is just always in dev, you can always check in anything all the time and you don't have to worry about when release dates are, like just develop away and make progress. But then we're actually regularly taking snapshots from that or rebasing on that or pulling that into the stable branch in a way where the instability is actually affecting the stable branch, even if we're doing our best to like disable things or gate things off or whatever. That's problematic. So again, the more we know about the specifics of the mechanism, we can evaluate whether that's actually firewalled off. And then the kind of on the flip side, if the mechanisms that are being proposed in order to protect the release branch are sort of doing violence to the code, like, well, we are going to rip all the experimental code out. Like the process of doing that could itself be disruptive. Yeah. Like even though the intent is to keep the stable branch super, super stable, if it's a rip things out of the dev branch, like we just need to evaluate kind of the risks of the particular mechanisms being proposed. So that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think these are, I think when we have more meat in the proposal, these questions would really need answers.
And I think some of I wonder if some of the viability on the project that he was describing, having done this type of a flow, if that was dependent on a robust and healthy CI and test suite and infrastructure. Like this is easier to imagine if you know you have a solid base from which you build on and a culture of always keeping CI green. But the opposite of that is like what Jordan sort of says, like if dev is just anything merges and health is whatever, that's going to get fixed later in some other stream.
Super, super thorough coverage of all the inputs and outputs to the system. So one of the things that I've been looking at is generation or fuzz testing of APIs to make sure that every API field that we know how to encode and decode, whether they're alpha or beta or GA or whatever, is represented in the test that not only makes sure we can round trip and everything on the particular release we're on, but also says, well, could this have been persisted in the previous release? And if we encounter that persisted data, are we going to fall over or still be able to read it? And we don't have great processes in place for capturing the data that can make it from release to release right now. But I agree. If we had much better coverage of things like that, then we would know when we broke something. And you can imagine that feeding back into processes in the dev branch that say, nope, I'm sorry, a released snapshot could have persisted this data. You can no longer change that. If you want to change that, you need to do it in a new field or something like that.
Yeah.
From the project's perspective, how do we measure this right now? Is there indicators for coverage? Do we run any tools? I know there are.
The coverage is very coarse grained. It's not nearly at the level that we need it to be. So it's at the level of, is this API call made? But we have no idea what individual fields are being exercised. And most of the exercise of individual fields is at the unit test level, which means you don't get the benefit of cross version, like read in persisted data from the previous release.
this is a good GitHub issue. The KEP process now brings in a new requirement that you need to have some kind of test plan, which is a good thing in terms of
And
coverage.
the requirement that you're testing upgrade, downgrade as well, or have a plan for how that would be. But that's different than having a test that actually covers it, because as developers, we're often bad at recognizing the need. So like you might write up a KEP and get it past even all your stakeholders that says we didn't have anything that needed covered there. But like Jordan says, like if you don't actually feed in a representative set of older data, you don't know whether you might have missed something.
Like we have round trip tests that sweep every API object in the system and make sure they can be round tripped, and we don't depend on individual API authors to remember that they need to write a round trip test. And so I'm imagining something similar for this kind of thing that snapshots on releases and has a corpus of serialized data that it reads in. And anytime a new field shows up, that gets flagged in a test, and something will go generate a fuzzed fixture or something to keep that corpus up to date. That's what I'm looking into. There are some tools around that for Protobuf especially, but there are none that I've found for the types of APIs we have. So we may have to copy and write something similar ourselves.
Yep, I think this is something we should probably track on GitHub as an issue that, that is, I see this as a solvable problem in a way that it is a challenge in technology rather than a process, irrespective of whether it matches the proposal or not, but it's probably good to have coverage analysis and metrics that would tell us the health of the project and the health of the master versus any release. So someone was saying something.
Yeah, I think certainly I've had a couple of problems in the past where that exact sort of thing has bitten us as when we've been trying to upgrade. Even things like, I think there was a bug in 1.11 about reading in the config file for the kubelet, where for a release that kubelet file went case insensitive, and so we set up a whole bunch of stuff that we got the case wrong, and then when the bug was fixed in 1.12, we got a whole bunch of stuff stopped working in subtle ways. Yeah, that sort of thing is like, yeah, I mean, I don't know how the hell you test for that, but yeah, that one actually meant we had someone spend like 2 weeks trying to get to the bottom of why things were behaving in this weird way.
Are you importing the external or the internal kubelet config? Because there are a couple.
This is
Yeah,
the serialized kubelet config file.
Yeah, it was the kubelet config file because we tweaked a whole bunch of the QPS settings for talking back to the API server, and those basically turned out to be reset back to default, even though we had them supposedly present in the file. But that was the YAML parser doing its thing, being like, that case is wrong. That's not a real value. I'm just going to throw it away. And it was not clear that it was thrown away. I'm more not saying, it's fixed now, right? Like, but it was just an interesting case of something where it broke in a really subtle way, because the QPS changes mean we only encounter that specific problem when clusters are pretty busy, and so obviously that's a problem you only see in prod really, and like I said, I don't know how you test for it, but it was very annoying to find.
I think Jordan kind of hinted at a part of this. Like we have unit test coverage, but this is more of an integration or end-to-end sort of thing, and you need a corpus of representative data.
Yeah.
It needs curated, and that's a big task to create.
Agreed.
And then I feel like too at the moment, and this kind of goes back to the dependency stuff. There's a little bit of hesitation in some parts of the project to making these opinionated choices, like what is representative or which set of things are we going to integrate. But you got to start somewhere with something.
Oh, yeah.
So you can test it.
I'm thinking much more mechanical. I'm not thinking opinions at all. Like for fields that are enums, do we have a test that loads every possible enum? For other fields that are optional, do we have a test that creates the object without that field present and with that field present. Like I'm not looking for like the end-to-end behavior. I'm purely looking at the inputs and outputs to the API. Yeah. So I'm hopeful that in my mind, something like that you could actually generate and then kind of refine with hints to the generator that are the kinds of things that we wanted to put in our schema anyway. So for enum fields, like having a structured way to say, here are the possible values. Like that would be good for the generator. That would also be good to put in the documentation. So the types of things that I would see being needed to be changed to support something like this are generally useful things that would also support usability goals as well.
We should also do things like if the cases of the fields change, we should bump the version. So I don't know what the project mechanic is. Once we reach V1 for something, can we go V2 or how should we do it?
Yeah, so you can always introduce new major versions, and they typically would follow at least like a beta GA stage. In the case of the case change, the field case didn't actually change. It went from being case insensitive to being case sensitive, or case sensitive, briefly case insensitive, and then back. And so it was a case of like pick which version you want to be incompatible with.
Yeah, yeah.
I
mean,
yeah, so that was a particularly unfortunate incident. Yeah, I think the types of things that we could have done better there. It was announced, but we could have announced it more audibly, more visibly, and then also considering how to, at the very least, warn and possibly fail for config file type inputs if the case was mismatched. Some of that work is being investigated now with the component config having a strict config parser, so that if you try to start a component and you've misindented or typoed some config, the component will like fall over and say, no, you're telling me to do things I don't know how to do. You probably don't want that. So some of that is feeding back in. That probably should have been part of the release where we fixed the case insensitive bug.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, like it's not so much that I really care that much that there was a problem. It was more that it was an interesting problem because it was kind of weird. We just got super unlucky that we happened to generate our config files in the version where it was case insensitive, and so yeah. I mean, and there's also the standard other stuff that you see with the YAML parsing things, where if you pass an int field where it expects a string, you will lose definitely that field and maybe the rest of that indent level of config, depending on how that parser feels that day.
Coming back to the proposal, I think the proposal will not be able to cover everything. We should always be pragmatic about, not everything would be addressed by the proposal, nor the project will be in perfect shape, even if it decide to go ahead with the proposal as the recommendation. So,
but I feel
yeah,
like
I actually see a lot of the coverage type of things as being independent of the proposal. Like I want that. No matter, like, even if we didn't change a thing about our support statements, I want this to help prevent regressions.
Yeah.
Going back to the discussion at KubeCon in Seattle that we had and kind of the BOF there, we had a bunch of things like this that we talked about as just generic needs. And I think as we're hashing these back and forth, we're gonna at some point have something for a document that kind of covers the desired outcomes and improvements and any of these potential KEPs, because I'm imagining we might have multiple KEPs or proposals around prospective changes. I see those as things that we would then use to weigh a proposal to say, like, how is it going to address these types of things, and maybe they're orthogonal, we do them regardless, but that we're looking at those being kind of like a gating criteria, maybe having these things established as part of whatever we're doing. And then we need hands building all of these things. It's not just like documenting the needs, but then actually driving to implementation.
Yeah, separate work streams would be great. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm having a slightly different view from what Tim proposed last week. he completely suggests to change the release model. So if we consider the LTS as we just pick a version of LTS, we can then not have to backport any API changes at all. We can just keep this LTS as a separate stream and not consider API changes, only critical bug fixes. And the question is, what is a critical bug fix? And we can define that, I think. But my view is much more simple than what Tim proposed. But I'm not sure it's worthy of a cap. Maybe I can write a Google Doc how I see LTS from my perspective. But I don't consider APIs at all for LTS. LTS is just a release. So we pick 116, and for instance, and we basically support it with security fixes and critical bug fixes. If we have to backport an API change, it's because there's some sort of critical fix that requires API tweak. And we, yes?
I think this is kind of like what I was calling like the documentation path. At some point you snapshot, you've got your thing that you're going to call supported for some period of time, but that act of snapshotting or branching or whatever the mechanism there is, at that point you have code in that branch. Well, you either do or don't, right? You're either going to have code there that is some alpha, beta, early dev state, or you rip it out, like Jordan was saying, or you have some type of mechanism that allows that stuff to be turned off so the stable user isn't subjected to that stuff. And I think our proposals are going to need some treatment of that mechanism and the choices there.
I mean, if an API is alpha, we can freeze it to alpha in this LTS cycle. It doesn't have to change. For kubeproxy, for instance, it has
but
to
does
be
it
an
need
alpha.
actively turned off, or does a user need prevented from using it, or like are there choices there that need declared? Because I felt like Tim was sort of proposing that stuff wouldn't, maybe, and I think that's maybe what Jordan was asking. Like there was some treatment there to like how chunks of bigger feature code move or don't.
I think because the risk there, right, is that you're risking like weird Heisenberg kind of things if you're pulling code out of a branch where it was in like if it was sort of tested and developed with all these other things turned on, and then you take it out to make things stable, then you're the kind of risking producing weird behavior where, because this other code that you thought did nothing to code over the other side of the project, but it turns out they are actually related, and you won't know until you try and make it stable, and then it turns out these things were actually coupled and we didn't know.
So currently, a release branch in Kubernetes is considered stable, and we don't touch it. We don't make any drastic changes. We can do that.
But we don't have criteria on that, and I think it hasn't quite been an issue, but it's something that needs formalized. I mean, there's something that went by for the 113 branch just last week where I pinged the authors and said, like, this looks like a feature. And it was a size XL change. So like that definition of critical bug fix it needs more clarity. And we've had cloud providers in a couple of instances that are pushing things in aggressively. As we decouple, it becomes a little harder to say who gets to make that choice on something that's isolated to a particular feature or SIG area or provider area.
So I wanted to propose that there should be a LTS committee of sorts, where basically our LTS team is formed, and these are the people who decide what goes in.
Isn't that this group?
What do you mean?
Well, I think Lubomir is saying like that the actual specific content branches, like would this PR merge to that branch versus this branch?
For the LTS branch specifically, what merges? And so in terms of features, I mean, for instance, in Ubuntu, they have LTS releases. Do they merge features? What can be defined as a feature?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key part there is that it's always going to be hard to write down rules for that, because a large part of then the important part is going to be how those rules get interpreted by people doing it. So just having it, you're right, having a smaller set of people who are the people who apply the rules will give you a bit more consistency.
I think one point to make was that if you don't allow APIs to be part of, standardization of APIs to be part of LTS, in some ways, your upgrade story is a little challenging because you don't know whether you can guarantee upgrades or not. So it would be good to get more specifics on what your proposal idea is in a doc. It would help compare apples to apples, or at least answer some of these details.
So the upgrade story is not challenging because you don't jump from an LTS branch to the latest master. The Windows updates, how they work, you do incremental updates. You jump from version to version. You don't jump like over 5 versions. So if we support upgrades between incremental versions, we don't have to do this jump.
But I mean, that's the state. That's kind of the state where we are now, right? Like the problem is that if you declare a longer term support window and you haven't changed the API deprecation window, then a year later, then you mark something as the new LTS, and in that time, the things that were alpha in the previous LTS have gone all the way to stable, and have significantly changed behavior, so that if you happen to be using them in the alpha state in the previous LTS, then it's going to be difficult to walk people through doing that upgrade, because there's been more than a full deprecation API object deprecation cycle in the time that your LTS has been running. So that I think that's why I think Jordan mentioned it before, but like a large part of what defining any longer term thing it has to include the API deprecation policy, because otherwise the life cycle of an API object, if the life cycle of an API object is smaller than your long-term support release window, then an API object could live and then die and be removed within within your LTS window. And what happens if someone's using that, or that's what I mean. Like the windows need to be aligned.
Yes, well, there are problems definitely, but also there are conversation tools. Have you been using conversation tools in your projects/products? Converting from an old API to a new one. Because in KubeADM we have this, like the users use a version, and the new version of the API completely changes, but we have a conversation tool that ports the old version to a new one.
That can work for KubeADM because it has its configuration files. You don't have live consumers of multiple versions of your APIs simultaneously. But the REST APIs that Kubernetes serves have to be able to round trip back and forth between them because they have multiple live users. So if you are only dealing with configuration, you can do forward compatibility only. You don't have to round trip necessarily. So a conversion tool that takes an old version of a config file and brings it up to date with the new version works fine. But all of the Kubernetes REST APIs have to be round trippable. So that's one difference between what kubeadmin does.
So something we can do in the LTS release cycle is to never upgrade the REST APIs.
Yeah, we don't backport API changes today. I agree that the different proposals about different styles of LTS should probably be written down, like what exactly is being suggested, and just like we're kind of asking for Tim St. Clair's proposal, like big picture, what's the idea, and then if there's not overriding objection to it, it's like, all right, well, we'd be interested in hearing the mechanics of it. Similarly for what you're describing, like big picture, what's the idea? Is it just support one release for longer, and what would be involved in that? Some of what we talked about earlier, if we wanted to support one release for a year, does that fall within the boundaries of the support windows for the things we depend on, like Golang and etcd and things like that? Kind of working through that. And some of that exploration is going to be similar no matter what we do. Like if we want to support any type of release for a year, we need to make sure that we have a version of Go that will get security fixes within that year. If we want to go longer than a year, we would have to make sure we can, make sure our language runtime will support us. So things like that are going to be common. I was going to ask actually if it would make sense to split some of those questions out so that they could inform any LTS proposal that came along. So the dependencies and supported versions and lifetimes seem like a useful thing to shard off and let people go figure out. Things like Go, it's not a CNCF project, but it's an open source project, finding out what their support statements are, finding out why they are the way they are, if it's a matter of manpower, if we wanted to see that lengthened, if that could be something that they would accept help on, or if that is a pretty entrenched like 2-version 1-year policy. Similarly for etcd, that is a CNCF project, so there might be more involvement there. But yeah, enumerating those, figuring out what the current state is, and then figuring out like what, if we wanted to see those lengthened to support LTS to a year, 4 releases from 3, or whatever the proposal is, what would it cost, time-wise, people-wise, money-wise? So.
A bunch of our discussion just now was tied specifically to the assumption that you would do upgrade in place, and that there's also been folks who say, well, we'd never do that. And I think we need to find somebody who would present like that similar kind of proposal document of here's what that world would look like if we didn't do that at all. I think we would owe the community, we as a community would owe the community of consumers that mechanism that does like a built-in native A/B deployment migration type of thing or something. And people have talked about having those themselves, but there isn't like the upstream canonical preferred way to do that. That's also then in our support or our CI test infra.
Yeah.
If you ask me, the whole test infra story is the scariest in terms of LTS because there's so much technical depth there.
So I've looked at test infra and I've been involved in it for the last 6+ months, and I've seen there are scary parts and there are scary parts in all projects. So it's kind of being worked in CI/CD for the last 10 years. I've seen all the projects that had so many scary parts. It's, it's like when you are inside the project, you know more bugs about it, and you get scared about it. Release engineering is a brave job. And I kind of feel that, yeah, we are having issues, but they do not prevent someone from running Kubernetes in production today. So we have made progress. I agree, there are scary parts, and there needs to be changes, but I think API standardization, getting better test coverage, these are going to be in the project even after 10 years of this project maturing, because there'll be new ideas, new ways to solve the problem. There'll be scalability issues, etc., etc.
So on my list, I know we're running out of time. On my list is to engage with SIG testing on the sort of fuzzing fixture compatibility skew aspect. Is there a class of tests that would be useful? Like our infrastructure makes it pretty easy to spin up a cluster and run a suite of tests on it. From what I understand, it doesn't make it very easy to say, I want to test this version of this component with that version of that component, and then run a suite on it. Is there someone who could engage with SIG testing to find out if that capability exists, and if it doesn't, if that would make sense to kind of develop separately or as part of the existing tooling?
So I already have an answer. So we don't have such a such a mechanic to basically say one of the components is older version. We don't have support for such custom SKU testing. Everything is kind of baked, custom baked. And so if you want to test on GC, for instance, you have to have the so-called deployer written in for the kube test binary, and it's far from customizable in terms of, for instance, the kubelet. In the kube NDM tests, we had a deployer called Kubernetes Anywhere, and it supports something like that. But basically, my point is that we have to write new deployers if we want to support like SKUs between the components.
I would like to check right now. Sorry, Lubomir, we are at 1 minute past the meeting time, so we should probably push this topic to next meeting. Also, we can chat on Slack for further on this. And I would like to end this meeting because I also need to rush to another meeting. And so this meeting is recorded, and if you have any action items, please mark it on the minute talks. It's easier to do it that way, and I'll post up the recording link once it's available to me. Thank you everyone for joining the meeting, calling this meeting. Bye-bye. Thank you everyone.